Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of the Bangalore Literature Festival. And we kick off with a session on system error, where big tech went wrong and how we can reboot. Joining us today from the west coast of the US is Professor Mehran Sahami. Welcome, Mehran, to the program. And in Nama Bengaluru, we have our well-known data privacy lawyer, author, Rahul Mathan. Thank you, both of you, for doing this session. Rahul will be in conversation with Professor Sahami, and we will be in a position to take some questions towards the end of the session. Over to you, Rahul.
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you, Mehran, for doing this at what is not very late at night at your time, but nevertheless is late enough. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it being here.
First of all, congratulations on the book. It's a great book in that it is probably the first book that I have read that sets it in this particular context. I mean, today we all know about technology, and I think we're at the point where some of the sheen of technology has dulled. We love the fact that it does these wonderful things for us, but I think we're all aware of how horribly things can go wrong with technology, and that so technology is this double-edged sword, and we really don't understand what we should be doing to ensure that we don't mess things up. And there have been so many books written about this. Shoshana Zuboff coined the term surveillance capitalism. Cathy O'Neill, and you reference her book in your book, wrote about the weapons of mass destruction. Jamie Bartlett has written this book about the people versus tech, about how tech is destroying democracy. And all of them are sort of focused on, that there are bad people or there are bad technology. And I don't mean to mischaracterize any of the things that they say, but the message comes out in this binary black and white. And the solution seems to be, just give people an ethics course or teach people how to build better technology and we'll solve it. But it's not as simple as that. As someone who's been engaged with this and worked with tech companies for over 2 decades, I know that there's no such thing as a bad person. I mean, of course, there are bad people, but that's not the problem with tech. And what I liked about system error is that you step away from this and you try and analyze the entire system and say that from this vantage point, the problem is much more fundamental, and it is not so much bad elements, but the entire system. And so, look, I'm really glad that we're having this discussion. But before we get into what you've actually written in the book, I wanted to just talk about about the genesis of the book and the fact that you are one of 3 authors, and each of you bring a very unique and different perspective. You're a software developer. You worked in Google. But your co-authors are philosophers and political scientists, and it sounds like the start of a really good joke. But I'm sure we're really happy that it ended up with this book. But surely there's something about that combination that lends itself to the conclusions that you've come to in the book.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here and for the analysis of the book as trying to take a more nuanced approach towards some of the issues in big tech, because that's exactly what we were hoping for, was not to write a polemic on one side or the other about technology being this utopian panacea solver of all problems, or technology being the cause of all problems that we have, because really it has good and bad elements together. And the way the genesis of the book, the way it came about, was that Rob Reich, who's a philosopher, Jeremy Weinstein, who's a public policy expert who actually worked in the Obama administration in the United States for several years, and myself as the technologist, came together about 4 years ago to teach a class at Stanford around issues in technology and ethics, because we saw a lot of students moving into computer science, a lot of students graduating from the university who were starting new companies, who were going to work at these larger companies, really grappling with issues of what does it mean to work in big tech? What are some of the issues that come up, that we'll certainly get into more detail on momentarily, but we wanted to give them a framework to think about these things. And so the way we think about it is through these three different lenses, one being the philosopher, which looks at values and tries to understand why are things like privacy important to us? Why does human autonomy actually matter from some deep fundamental level? The public policy expert to look at things like, well, how do we actually measure some of the effects if we think of this as a social scientific problem? And then what do we try to do from the policy standpoint to create guardrails to prevent some of the bad outcomes from happening while still trying to preserve space to get the good outcomes of technology? And me as the technologist, coming from the perspective of what does the technology enable? What can it do? Also, what can't it do? So when we think about some of these issues, when we want to grapple with, say, algorithmic decision making, we can think about what are policies that make sense from a technological standpoint and which ones don't. Because we've seen both actually put forward. We've seen well-intentioned policymakers try to make policy for regulation that just doesn't make sense from a technological perspective. And so after teaching this class for about 3 years, we wanted to reach a wider audience. We thought these are issues that are important, not just for students at the university, but really for people in general who in their daily lives are interacting with technology, either explicitly because they're using a mobile device or on the web, or implicitly having systems make decisions about them algorithmically that they may or may not know are actually happening, to identify and understand what the issues are, to realize what's at stake in terms of value trade-offs, and to think about who's making these judgments now and potentially ways we could think about putting in guardrails in the future to get better outcomes for everyone.
I mean, I would love to get into a little more detail on how to actually make this work, because this sort of multidisciplinary approach, at least instinctively feels to me, should be applied in many areas of policy making as well as in each of the other areas. But I want to get into the book because the way you've approached it is different, and two parts. One, of course, is the technologist, and you speak a little bit about just engineers and the way they think about the world. And then the technologies, and you've gone through many technologies. I do want to get into at least three of them. I don't know how much time we'll have, but I think it's really important to spend some time, because not many people have looked at it this way, which is the technologist's mindset. And one of the things you speak about is this concept of optimization and the fact that engineers are looking, they have a preference for optimization. Can you explain a little bit about that and how that actually influences the way big tech develops and the things that it makes?
Sure. So there's a particular mindset that you see in engineering, and is particularly acute in computer science, which is this notion of wanting to optimize. You have some particular objective function that you may want to increase some value, for example. But you also see this in aspects of life where people talk about life hacking, especially engineers, right? Ways they can try to do things to save time in their life, or ways that they can try to make things more efficient. So it's just a particular orientation toward the world. And that orientation really comes as a result of being trained as an engineer or computer scientist, right? We think about our algorithms in terms of how quickly or efficiently they execute. We think about, say, for example, power systems as how little power they might consume to be able to do some kind of computation. And so we're always trying to work toward greater efficiency and greater optimization. What happens in the tech world is these notions of optimization, especially when you have technologists as leaders of companies, translate into a management philosophy. And the management philosophy is what we want to do is we want to have particular metrics for the company that we use to measure the health of the company and the growth of the business. And we want to optimize these over time. And they have various names like key performance indicators or objectives and key results. And the idea is that, that we need to have something that's measurable. And that's one of the critical quantities. And so what that means is that you take the objectives of a business and you have to translate them into measurable quantities. So to make this concrete, let's consider a company like Facebook. Their stated mission is to connect the world. Okay, well, what does it mean to connect the world? How do you turn that into measurable quantities? For them, it's things like measuring the number of people on their platform, the amount of time people spend on their platform, the number of pieces of content that they click on or engage with or place some sort of reaction on. So the more of that, those are measurable quantities, the more of that they get, the greater engagement they see on their platform, and they equate that with connecting the world. But the problem is when you try to optimize for that, there's lots of reasons why people might click on a piece of content that don't actually have to do with greater connection. I might click on a piece of content or respond to it because it makes me angry, because it's inflammatory, because it's in fact trying to arouse emotions in me that are not positive, or that it's getting me to try to react to something or take me on a particular path toward polarization. And so greater engagement at that level that causes polarization or that causes outrage on those metrics that they measure actually look like a positive, but in the real world, they have negative impacts. And when you're just trying to optimize for the metrics, you lose sight of the other externalities that are generated as a result of the business when all you're measuring are these things that are easy to measure. It's easy to measure how much people click on a piece of content. It's hard to measure political polarization. And if that's not part of the equation for what you're trying to optimize, then you lose sight of the bigger picture. And so that's part of the question too, is who gets to set these metrics? Right now, these metrics are set by executives in companies, or even in some cases, the engineers that are just building the systems. And these metrics build into them particular value trade-offs. And we can talk about those when we get into the particular technologies, because with different technologies, you see different value trade-offs. But what it ultimately means is the questions around values are being made by the executives of these companies. And if we really think about what kind of values we want at a societal level, those should be questions that society should answer, not just company executives.
And one of the things that you mentioned in the book, which really resonated with me, is that, as technology becomes so much part of our lives, you said Facebook's goal is to connect people. And this is really a very sort of societal role that technology is playing. And every tech company has a similar kind of contribution to society. When there is an optimization bias or a preference for optimization, it's the people who optimize that actually can get to decide what problems are worth solving. And that's a really powerful a role that you play. Particularly, it didn't really matter if technology was stuck in some corner, but technology is everything in society. And so the people who decide what problems are worth solving are actually taking very fundamental, significant decisions with regard to the direction of our political economy and society at large.
That's absolutely true. And one example of that, in addition to applications like social networks like Facebook, if you look at, for example, some of the apps around the gig economy, so you look at delivery applications, for example, and what that's done is it's created an entire shift in the way economies work. And it's also distributed the gains of those economies. So if you think about the delivery drivers that might be delivering for a particular app, those delivery drivers, if they're treated as contractors and not employees, don't have the same rights as employees. They may not have access to the same benefits. And so the question becomes, where are the gains coming from? So the gains that are made by the business are being privatized to the executives and the actual employees who might, for example, be getting benefits from stock or whatever the case may be in that company. So who's taking on the burdens? Well, you now have the gig economy workers who aren't getting benefits they might otherwise get in full-time employment. And at the same time, if they want to try to seek out other kinds of benefits or try to get other kinds of services, like say medical services, well, who provides those now? Those now become socialized by the government. So what's happening in some sense is the economy is becoming distorted, where the gains are being privatized by the companies, but the social responsibilities are now being placed on the doorstep of government.
You had there's a line in there in the book that really resonated with me around the metrics point. And you say, and I'm quoting, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts," which is, it actually makes a lot of sense. But when everything is driven by this metric of something or the other, you said OKR, there's PKI, there's all of these acronyms. We've got to understand that some of these things just can't be counted, can't be measured in that sense. But I want to also move to regulators, because regulators haven't properly understood what the implications of their regulations are. And in the book, you speak about two examples of internet exceptionalism that actually gave birth to the internet. I mean, the proliferation of broadband, for one, in the US, and also Section 230, which was the exception for user-generated content, both of which are arguably the reasons why the internet flourished in the way that it did, but now have sort of created a situation where we've got a fairly intractable problem in that we've got a particular a set of rules of the road based upon which these companies operate that are actually making it very difficult to put in place appropriate regulation. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because particularly the exceptionalism under Section 230, which is the intermediary liability or the exclusion from liability for user-generated content, is something that has now been replicated in countries around the world. India has an intermediary liability protection provision in its Information Technology Act that we've been struggling with increasing frequency. We're looking to amend that regulation to try and find a way to regulate things like hate news and fake news and hate speech and that kind of thing. So maybe if you can just shed a little bit of light on that, I think it'll also help as we start talking about the technologies themselves, because this is really the source of the problem.
Right. You're absolutely right. And I think, it's one of these things that over time, the intent of regulation and the need for regulation changes. So in 1996, when the Communications Decency Act got passed in the United States and you had Section 230 written into it, was at the time when the internet was beginning to flourish, right? We saw the World Wide Web beginning to take off because just a few years earlier, we had the first web browsers created. And what there was a feeling of was, in order for this technology to really take off and have an impact, we need to limit liability and we need to roll back on regulations. So prior to that point, there were also a number of regulations about commercial activity on the internet that mostly got rolled back. So you could get the rise of things like online retailers. And Section 230, as you mentioned, was a critical piece of legislation that said for user-generated content, there's no liability for the hosting platform, right? An analog to, you could think of the telephone company. You don't hold the telephone company liable for what people say on the phone line to someone else. And so at the time, it seems like a very reasonable regulation. Well, 25 years later, we live in the same regulatory regime, more or less. But now that we've seen things like misinformation and disinformation and hate speech online, we realize that these things are being amplified by these platforms, and there might need to actually be some liability for them to take more serious steps to try to moderate this content more heavily. And the question is, how do you do that? Because if you completely repeal CDA 230, you create lots of liability. At one level, it potentially stifles competitors because they don't have the resources to be able to do the same kind of content moderation as the larger players. And at the same time, there's a question of how much content in a reasonable way can you actually moderate? Would we actually get a much greater stifling of free expression on these platforms because they become so worried about liability? One of the things that's been put forth, which seems like an interesting direction to go, but still has more nuance to work out, is a notion that there's still a regulatory oasis from liability. So you wouldn't have liability in cases where the content is not algorithmically amplified. So you would only have liability in cases where your algorithms, through an optimization or whatever the company is doing, actually amplify particular piece of content. I think it's an interesting direction to go, but it's one of those places where you need to bring the lens of technology to also look at the lens of regulation, because at first blush, the regulation sounds fine until you begin to dig into what does that mean technologically. And so let me give you two examples. One example is a search engine like Google. Basically, in a search engine, for any given queries, there's millions of documents that match. How do you pick the top 10? So if you have any reasonable mechanism to try to pick the more relevant content to bring to the top, that could, by definition, be algorithmic amplification. So if you define algorithmic amplification broadly, basically all search engines become liable for all content on the internet, which is an untenable position. So you need to have a more nuanced carve out there. Another example would be, if you think about that algorithmic amplification with respect to trying to filter content. So let's say I'm a social network and I find a way actually to filter a fair bit of hate speech. Does that mean that by filtering out hate speech, I've algorithmically amplified the remaining speech? By one definition, it is. But your intent was very good by trying to filter out the hate speech. So again, these are some of these things that once we get into the details and the nuance from a technological standpoint, they require further honing in the legislation. I think it's a good direction to go, but I don't think we're completely there with the current wording that's suggested for some of these laws.
And this is true of everything that we think about, right? So as we get into the details, we realize almost fractally that every problem that we find two sides to, when we go to any one of those sides to try and solve it, you find that there are two sides there as well. And so this whole thing, that nothing is black and white, actually pervades all the way down to the furthest extreme that you go, which makes our job, yours and mine, from different sides of the bench, very difficult. But I want to go into the technologies, and you discuss a lot of technologies, but I want to focus on three. Just, I guess, one, because I don't have the time to focus on all the others. And also, I've just picked these three: privacy, free speech, and algorithmic decision-making. Privacy, because just 3 days ago, the parliamentary committee that was debating India's new data protection law released its draft. And so it is extremely topical now, just this the conversation around how privacy in India is going to be regulated, maybe from early next year. And once again, in privacy, the problem with privacy is it's like all the other areas, not binary. And I think you discuss the Bentham's panopticon, the fact that Bentham came up with this solution for keeping prisoners in check, which is very similar to what Shoshana Zuboff calls our surveillance capitalism, where at every point in time everyone is being watched. And then you also speak about the challenges of implementing end-to-end encryption faced with the challenges of that law enforcement face in actually tracking down criminals, which is something that society needs. And in all of this, it's tempting to find tech solutions for this, but you point out in this sort of fractal way that we just discussed that the solutions like anonymization are not complete and things like that. So can you discuss this fundamental challenge, which is technology creates these privacy problems, and when we try and solve them with more technology, we find that even that technology is inadequate in a sense to completely solve the problem.
Absolutely. Well, I have to say, I love having this conversation with you, Rahul, because your depth of understanding and nuance of these things is incredible. So I love the fact that you can see how to surgically look at these issues. In terms of data privacy, I think you're absolutely right. It's a big one that in the early days, there were attempts to say we could take this data and make it anonymous and then make it available for some of the more beneficial impacts we would get. And there are actually very beneficial uses of technology. So I have a number of research colleagues who, for example, work on biocomputation, trying to use computational techniques to understand biological phenomena, for example, for drug design, to identify better therapies for better medical outcomes. They say their greatest barrier to making advances is not more advanced algorithms, it's not more compute power, it's access to data. So there's beneficial things that we would want to get from this data, but at the same time, what we find is in many applications, we interact with the notion of data maximalism. As much data as possible is being gathered about us in the hope that this data can be used to monetize different aspects of the business in the future. And so I think it's important to understand that certain technologies like anonymization that were touted early on are actually in most cases ineffective. It turns out that in many cases you can infer who a person is. I'll give you one example just based on their online activity. There was a case, this is about 20 years ago now, where America Online, if you remember the big starting off point on the internet for many people, wanted to create, help researchers. They were well-intentioned. They wanted to help researchers better understand web search. So they said, we're going to make a log available of queries that people have sent to our search engine, but it's going to be anonymized. So we're going to actually try to filter out names, because a lot of times people try to search for their own name, or friends' names. You're going to try to filter out names. And we're not going to attach to it any kind of unique identifier. All you'll know is that, user X might have made this set of queries and user Y made this other set of queries. Well, it turns out even if you don't have names, a lot of times people make queries about information that's personal to them, that's about the region they live in, the kinds of businesses they're interested in, other aspects of their lives. And so some journalists got a hold of this data and were able to identify completely several individuals just from their query history. Even though there were no names involved, they could hone down to an actual individual. And as a result of this, the researcher who released the data was fired, their boss was fired, and ultimately the chief technology officer of AOL was fired. So it went all the way up to the chain of command to the C-suite. That's how serious this breach was. So the notion that some of these technologies, that well-intentioned people, even technologists, think will work, don't always pan out. So we need to think about it from another standpoint, which is assuming we can't get full anonymity. What are things that we can understand that are regulations we might want to put in around data? So some simple ones are things like data transparency. People need to understand when data is collected about them and what kind of data is collected about them. They need to have ownership, the opportunity to opt out, to say, I don't want that data collected about me, or if you already have it, I want it deleted. And they need to have portability, which is even in cases where they've put their data on a particular platform, they need to have the opportunity to move it somewhere else. So let's say I'm, on Facebook and I have all my pictures there and my friend connections, and Facebook starts doing things whose policies I don't agree with. I want to be able to move to another social network, but all that data should be able to move with me and interoperate with Facebook. And some people say that's a huge technical challenge. You could never get it to happen. Well, the shocking thing is there was actually a standard for doing this 15 years ago. It was called Open Social. And Google helped design it. A bunch of other companies were involved in designing it. Who didn't get on board with Open Social? Facebook, because it wasn't in their business interest to do so. But that's a place where regulation could actually mandate that kind of interoperability. And then you would find that people have more control over their data, both in terms of what's collected and how it's used, but also the ability to take their own data with them somewhere else if they want.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned, and this is a study that Alan Weston did, actually was really interesting to me in this particular context, because he, as much as we beat our breasts about privacy, he divided the world into three types: privacy pragmatists, privacy fundamentalists, and privacy unconcerned. I mean, that sort of describes my social group. I wouldn't say I'm a fundamentalist, but I'm certainly a pragmatist. But there are fundamentalists who, and I say, go and live in an island where you're not touching anything, and then yes, you can be a fundamentalist. And then the privacy unconcerned, who are, I have nothing to lose, because, but when, of course, everyone has something to lose when their privacy is breached. But I wanted to stick on the point of tools, because there are people who have been making tools that help these things. You mentioned Tim Berners-Lee's Solid project and Inrupt, which is the company that they're using to build those pods that allow you to control your data. I think there are moves afloat in the EU and in Australia. India certainly has a model which we're very proud about, called DEPA, which implements this portability. And I just want to understand how the introduction of these sorts of tools, because they're relatively recent, and probably we don't have enough information as to how they will work. But could that be a solution to use fire to fight fire, as it were?
I think that's a great point. And one of the technologies along those lines is differential privacy, which is something that has come up, really gained more momentum probably in the last 5 years, but has been around for a little over a decade now. And is the idea that you want to have, assuming you want to make data available for people to do various kinds of analyses, how do you guarantee, or to some extent guarantee, and there's all kinds of precise technical definitions and probabilistic definitions with respect to the guarantee, that no individual's data can be breached. And the basic idea at a simplified level is what you do is you inject some level of noise or some level of variability into the data. So if you try to ever retrieve the record for any one person, you can't get any information that's identifying about one person. But if you try to get something in the aggregate, like give me the average of this value across these people, give me their average age, give me their average income, whatever the case may be, which in many cases is really all you need for certain kinds of applications, you get a value that it's pretty close to accurate, but is computed in a way that it doesn't give you any information about any of the individuals used to compute that value. Now, that's a powerful technology. It's actually been deployed in a number of cases. The flip side about it is when you have a large data set of many people. So, for example, let's say the population of India, and there's some subpopulation that you care about that is relatively small, the injection of noise into that large data set can actually be sufficient to wash out the small subgroups in the population. So it creates a fairness issue. It creates an issue about who's actually now well represented in that data. Are large majorities, small minorities get washed out. So it has potential, but we need to be aware of what the trade-offs are. And all of these things have value trade-offs. When you mentioned encryption, for example, is another technology that puts a heavy thumb on the scale of privacy, right? So if we consider an end-to-end encrypted platform, something like Signal, or even various apps on your iPhone, for example, are end-to-end encrypted. What it means is that no one, not even the company itself, can break that encryption. So you can send completely private messages from party A to party B. And that's great if you care about privacy as your primary value. But if you want to trade off other things, like if point A and point B are actually human traffickers, maybe you don't want them to have complete privacy in the information they're sending. So what we need to think about, what each of these technologies involves, is what those value trade-offs are and how we want to make them, being aware of the implications the technological decision we make actually has for values we care about.
And that's really a stark point, because it also has, a tweak on one direction has an impact on the other. So if you emphasize the value of cutting down trafficking, particularly in children, and I try and use child trafficking because it is the most emotive topic, and there's a lot of that's happening on these secure networks. That's certainly a good value to promote, but at the same time, any tool that is opened up means that whistleblowers and people that need that private communication for sometimes even their own safety will never have a space to do it. And so these trade-offs are actually really, really difficult to arrive at. So how does one equip policymakers and technologists to think about these things?
Right. I think there's two directions to go. One is considering various examples. And one example, that could work, but I think there was so much public backlash against it because people didn't really understand what it was the case of Apple actually scanning people's iCloud accounts for pictures of child pornography. I think that was actually a reasonable solution, both from a technological standpoint and from a policy standpoint, because basically what it said is your information still remains private, except for information that's in the cloud, in which case we will scan it for very specific kinds of content, and you will only have liability if with a very high degree of certainty, we identify that kind of activity on your account. Even then, you go through the standard legal due process if you were to fight a legal battle that arose out of that. And there was so much backlash to it because people didn't really understand. They believed that suddenly now all their data was available, that Apple could do whatever they wanted with it. They didn't look at the nuance of the regulation. So I think part of it is an educational standpoint to get people to understand what these policies actually mean, and also having those technological examples inform government policymakers as to the kinds of things that maybe they want to mandate. And that also gets the government behind the educational component of understanding what's really going on. So that's one aspect, is the examples. I think the other aspect that comes into it that we need to think about are at some level, what are the underlying principle that we want to uphold, and realizing that we never get a perfect solution. And this gets back to the optimization mindset. Technologists like to believe there's a correct solution. And part of the philosophical standpoint that, channeling my co-author, Rob Reich, if he was here, is to say there isn't one right solution. There's just better and worse solutions. And so when we understand that, what we can try to do is iteratively try to think about what is a better solution and how we would want to value these things. And who ultimately decides? Well, if you just leave it up to a company executive to decide, you may not get the outcome you want. So we need to actually exercise our rights as citizens. In places where we have the right to vote, we need to vote. We need to let policymakers know how we feel, and ultimately becomes the policymaker's responsibility to reflect the will of society.
We're at the halfway mark. I just want to remind everyone in the room that we're taking questions as well. So the way you need to do it is to raise your hand, and then I think the volunteers in the room will take you up to a microphone and we can speak. But just wanted to remind everyone to tee up their questions. I'm going to leave maybe 5 minutes towards the end for that. But I want to move to the next technology that you discuss. And if we run out of time, we really should cover this one because we're moving into an election here in India and free speech and just the use of internet and network technologies to speak is a really interesting and important conversation to have. And I think the point that you make is that our regulations, the First Amendment in the US, the fundamental right to freedom of speech and expression under Article 19 in the Indian Constitution, were designed in an era when it was not so easy to get your ideas heard by such a large number of people. But today we've got, we can just say something and vast numbers of people can hear it. And in many ways, our regulations sort of factored in the difficulty of disseminating technology into the way they were drafted. And so they seem a little inadequate today, given that none of those inherent protections are available in the law. So how do we deal with this problem of, on the one hand, upholding free speech, and on the other hand, trying to see that it doesn't get misused?
That's an excellent point. And I think it's a critical aspect to thinking about the internet. One of the things that, as you mentioned, is the context in which many of these free speech rights were created were at a time when there was not the same kind of reach that you could get online. And there's a line that one of our colleagues at Stanford, Renee DiResta, who is the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory, likes to use, is freedom of speech does not mean freedom of reach. Just because you have the ability to say something, you should have the ability to say it, but that doesn't mean you have a right to have it amplified all over the internet. And so one of the places that regulators can get involved is actually working with the technologists to say the same technology that amplifies these messages can also be used to restrict how widely distributed they are, right? So you can see various kinds of inroads along these lines and other ways that it would be easy to think about implementations on top of them. For example, the number of times that a post can be retweeted or shared in a social network can be limited until the veracity of that piece of information can be verified. So that way, things that are free, that are misinformation or disinformation can be limited in scope. Hate speech can also be limited in scope if we believe that there's an attack on someone's personal dignity. That's the place where it gets a little bit more nuanced because it involves an interpretation of what does it mean for a piece of speech to actually rise to a level of potentially inciting physical harm to a person. So it's not that the algorithms will be able to solve all of these problems, but if they limit the extent to which misinformation especially, can run rampant on the internet, at least it gives content moderators, both the algorithms and more importantly, the human beings who can see more of that nuance, more time to be able to identify, to filter, or to label this information. So I think that's one direction we want to go. Another direction is to use the algorithms to be able to better prioritize the things that human content moderators should look at. There's already some inroads around the way that there's interaction between humans and technology, but I think that there's more that we can do there. At some level too, when going back to Section 230 and potential liability that companies have, the more potential for liability you create, the more you will see companies put resources behind content moderation. And so part of the reason they put a fair amount of resources into them, but not as much as they could given the resources they have, is because they don't currently live in a liability regime that incentivizes them to do so.
And that's sort of where regulation comes in. And it's interesting that you talk about amplification, because amplification, once again, is a technology tool. And, you can tweak amplification to address that reach problem. I wanted to talk about just one other potential solution that other people have said, which is that, this pre-internet notion that there's no such thing as bad speech. We can counter views with other views, and you can you counter bad speech with good speech or better speech, and sort of create a marketplace of ideas where everyone can see a bunch of viewpoints, and they can then come to their own conclusion without sort of shutting someone up. And so even if you say something which society feels is bad or the moderator feels is bad, we should let them say it, but provide a counter view. But we're seeing this, I guess, internet-inspired cancel culture and deplatforming and all of these sorts of issues that are making this marketplace of ideas solution perhaps a little impractical and perhaps maybe not capable of being implemented in the way that we would like to. Any thoughts on that and how we can resolve that?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a asymmetry in some sense between good information and bad information. There's this old line that's attributed to Winston Churchill, which says, lies go halfway around the world by the time the truth gets its boots on, right? And that's the same kind of effect we see on the internet. Is, as a simple example, if you go to something like YouTube and you look for how many videos there are about the earth being flat versus the world being round, there are many more about the world being flat. Right. But so why does that happen? Because there's a group of people who have a vested interest in trying to convince some other group of people of something that's not true. You don't have a lot of people that have a vested interest saying, you know what, I want to create a video that says the world is round. Right. It seems weird. Why would you waste your time doing that? Because for the vast majority of the world, they expect that's their expectation of the world. Well, the same thing is true with lots of different bits of misinformation, right? People have a motivation to create misinformation. They want to affect the results of elections. They want to sway people's opinions. They actually want to create conflict. It's hard to be able to counter that by saying, well, I'm going to write news stories that's saying actually the world is okay, it's pretty good, people have more understanding of each other than we otherwise think. Those are strange stories to write, and they're not particularly convincing in the face of really virulent misinformation and active hate speech. So it's just an asymmetry. The marketplace of ideas breaks down in that case because the marketplace of ideas is built on an assumption that both the positive and the negative can be countervailing to each other, and there can be equal amounts, or in some sense, the amount of positive information will overwhelm the negative information. That's not what we see online because of the vested interests involved in the creation of that information.
I wanted to talk about algorithmic decision making, but we don't have enough time. And I do want to get to the solution that you propound. So I guess everyone will just have to buy the book to read not just algorithmic decision making, but also autonomous vehicles and various other technologies that you've gone into in the book with this sort of non-binary approach where there is no black and white. And I think it's really interesting to sort of flesh out all of those problems. But I want to ask you to just reflect, not in closing, because I think we've got two questions from the audience and I must keep place for that. But how do we solve this, given that there is, as you describe even in the title of the book, a system error, and that the solution has to be a systemic solution? I don't want to lean on you, but I just loved your analogy of regulating the information superhighway in the same way as we regulate the highway. And if you could just talk through the point with that analogy, it would be really good.
Sure. So the basic idea of the analogy is, with the advent of cars, the choice that if the only choice you were given was you can drive or you cannot drive, and if you decide to drive, good luck, be safe, we would get a lot of accidents, we'd get a lot of people killed, which is actually what happened with the advent of cars. So what we did was we created a whole system of regulation around it. We created lanes. We said what side of the road people should drive on. We created stoplights and speed bumps and all kinds of other sorts of things. You still have a choice in that system whether or not to drive, but now driving is safer for everyone because there's a whole system built around it. That's the same place we're at with technology. Is technology, we don't yet have the system. Companies give us a choice that says, well, if you don't like our application, don't use it. That's the same choice as driving versus not driving. It's kind of absurd because we actually see there's real benefits to using the technology. Our only choice shouldn't be to not use it. What we should expect is a set of guardrails that create a safer system. And those guardrails come in the things like the form of sensible data privacy regulations, regulations around understanding algorithmic decision making to give people transparency about what decisions are made and due process to challenge those decisions and to challenge those algorithms so that human beings can actually be more involved in the process. And even places, for example, where we see automation displacing people from jobs. If we see that that's coming 5 to 10 years down the line, that gives us an opportunity to say we need to put in re-education and reskilling programs now to prepare people who are going to be displaced by that automation to move into other jobs before they get displaced. So these are kind of places where we can have sensible regulations that even different parties can agree on, but we just have to be willing to take action and push our lawmakers to actually do so.
There are two questions, but I just want to ask you one last point, which is with regard to regulation. We've always felt that technology moves too fast and regulations just can't keep up. So how do we design regulation to work at the speed of the internet? I don't think any country has resolved it. India, I started working on a privacy law a decade ago, and we're just about to get our privacy law. Happily, the draft has evolved to keep up with times, but once it's passed, I don't want to take another 10 years to make the First Amendment if technology is moving so fast. So how do we address that problem?
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations on the policy you have pushed through. That's important that, things like that are actually happening. I think there's 2 points there. One is trying to create regulation that is agile in the sense that built into the regulation are processes for regular review and update for certain aspects that could be seen to evolve over time. But the second is also the notion that regulation doesn't always have to keep up with internet speed. What it needs to do is enforce the values we care about. And as long as those kind of values are reflected in the policies themselves, then the technology can try to evolve, but the values are still maintained with respect to that. It is one of the places that we see probably the biggest divergence between policymakers and technologists is the speed of change. But at some level, the writing of regulation was not meant to move fast and break things. When you break things with regulation, it's a lot worse. So it was meant to be deliberative. It was meant to adjudicate among multiple values and different points of view to get something that was better for everyone. And so personally, I know it moves slow, but the fact that it moves is more important than that it does something quickly and potentially gets it wrong.
I'm going to ask the people in the audience who had questions to step up to the mic.
Prashant, go ahead. Yeah, thank you for the wonderful session. My question is related to the area of inclusion. When you talked about amplification, right? How does the algorithms, the inherent biases, whether conscious or unconscious, which gets built into the algorithms, how would that impact inclusion or exclusion in a much larger way? Right. Once technology gets even into many more applications which touch our lives, because we deal with the area of inclusion in our company. So this is a question which we are grappling with. So if you could shed some light on that, it would be helpful.
Absolutely. And thank you for the question, Prashant. I think, one of the examples to consider for inclusion is there was a system built at Amazon to screen resumes. To put up with a large volume of resumes that were coming in terms of trying to decide who gets job interviews. And so they built a machine learning system that was based on historical data at Amazon of who they had brought on actually to hire. And what they found in building the system was heavily biased against women. So would downscore resumes, for example, if it had references to things like women's softball team or women in engineering. And so one of the good things was the people who built the system actually tested for that. They tested for things like gender bias before they deployed the system at scale, because had they deployed it at scale, what it would have done is just further amplified and scaled this gender biased decision making and actually created less inclusion in the company. So they actually tested for it. Now, the bad news is that they found that even after they found this gender bias, they couldn't fix it. They tried a bunch of things to actually fix the algorithm and they couldn't do it, right? This is Amazon, one of the most technologically sophisticated companies in the world, couldn't do it. So they ended up shutting down the system. right? And at the end of the day, sometimes those are the decisions we need to make. We need to understand what the impact is on things like inclusion and bias of our algorithms and try to fix it. In some cases, it's fixable. In cases where it's not, we need to be willing to make the decision to say that automation is not appropriate in those situations. And it's a big decision because it was a team that was focused on this problem for a long time, and they shut down the project and disbanded the team. But it was the right decision to make when you realize the impact the algorithm's having.
We have one more question from Dhruvatara. Please ask your
Hi,
question.
thank you both for this wonderful session. My question is slightly tangential, but I was wondering, with the internet, you have also the ability to sort of replicate and reproduce information, and this is often a problem for intellectual property. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on maybe regulation and intellectual property. What do you think about that?
I think it's a very complicated area. And I have to admit that intellectual property is not my particular forte because I'm not an intellectual property lawyer. What I've seen from the technology standpoint in terms of intellectual property regulation is there's a tendency often to try to protect more in terms of intellectual property than is really justified. So I see examples, for example, of things like patents that are way too broad in their scope and that limit technological innovation by others. At the same time, I do think there are places where someone creates something truly innovative and they should get an opportunity to actually be the owners in some sense of that technology for a particular period of time. But what I've seen overall in terms of the use, for example, of the patent system is it tends to be more abusive than it actually protects intellectual property. It's often used as a saber to threaten other companies to get royalties for technological developments that really are quite simple and that just weren't understood well by the patent office when the patents were granted. So we're also seeing cases where patents are being ruled to be invalid because they don't actually show sufficient novelty in the contribution, or that there's earlier inventions that they didn't cite that were actually available in the public domain. It's outside my area of expertise, but if I were to come down one way or the other, I'd actually say we're too restrictive in trying to protect intellectual property.
But Mehran, thank you so much for staying up late at night and for doing this. Congratulations once again on the book. As I said in my opening remarks, I haven't yet read a book that brings this nuance, which is sort of the system problem that I've thought about, instinctively felt, but could never articulate. I'm glad someone has done that. It is a thoughtful book that I would at least think, and that's what I've done, give it 2 reads, because things occur to you with the second reading that perhaps make more sense than they did the first time once you've read all the way through to the end. So thank you, Mehran, and I hope that the next time we have Bangalore Literary Fest, we can manage to convince you to come down and do this in person if this prevailing pandemic would have left us by then.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. Really love the conversation and really love just the level of intellectual rigor that you brought to it. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.